The wind carried dust across the wide Montana plains, whipping at the weathered boards of the ranch house that stood stubbornly against time, like its owner who leaned against the fence rail, watching the horizon with quiet expectation, his blue eyes sharp beneath the brim of a worn hat, his posture rigid as if bracing for the change he had invited into his life when he finally penned a letter, months ago, asking a stranger to be his wife, a mail-order bride who promised companionship, stability, and perhaps even love in exchange for the security of his homestead. But as days bled into weeks and then months, he began to wonder whether he had been foolish to put his heart into the hands of fate. For ranching was lonely work, and nights by the fire grew longer, when there was no one to talk to but the silence of the prairie. Yet on this particular day, fate arrived not in the form of the bride he had expected, but in the form of a creaking wagon that rolled unevenly into view, driven by a weary widow with shadows under her eyes, her dark hair tied back hastily, her body thin but strong from hardship. And beside her and behind her, 5 children clung to the sides of the wagon, their faces streaked with dust, their eyes wide with uncertainty, curiosity, and the guarded hunger of those who had known more loss than comfort. And the rancher's heart, so steady and disciplined, gave a lurch because though this was not the woman he had ordered, not the promise he had been waiting for, it was something unexpected, something human and raw. And before he even realized what he was doing, he was already stepping forward, tipping his hat, asking if they needed water, shelter, or food, his voice low and steady though inside. Him questions tumbled like loose stones. Down a canyon. For who was she? Why was she here? And what twist of fate had placed her in his path on the very day he thought his bride might finally arrive? The widow lifted her chin, though her eyes carried both pride and exhaustion, and she explained in a voice that cracked with both strength and weariness that she had been traveling west in search of a relative who might take them in after her husband's death in a mining accident left her with no roof, no coin, and no plan but survival. And though the rancher had spent years guarding himself against unnecessary entanglements, there was something about the way those 5 children stared at him. One clutching a ragged doll, another biting his lip to hide hunger, the eldest boy already trying to stand tall like a man, though he was barely 12, that stirred a place inside. Him he didn't know had gone cold, and in that moment he knew with a certainty, deeper than reason, that his life was about to change forever. Because the story he thought he had ordered by mail was nothing compared to the story God himself had delivered by wagon. And as the sun sank behind the hills and the first stars pricked the twilight, he offered her a place to stay for the night, only the night, he told himself. But both of them felt in their bones it would be longer than that, much longer, and neither could predict how the days ahead would test them, break them, and bind them in ways no letter could ever promise. And friends, if you want to know how this journey of faith, grit, love, and family unfolds, make sure you stay with us, because the rancher's heart, the widow's courage, and those children's laughter and tears will weave a tale you won't forget. So if you're enjoying this story of resilience and unexpected blessings, remember to hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next. Because trust me, you're going to want to hear how this story ends. The morning after the widow and her 5 children arrived at the ranch, the sun rose over the plains with a brilliance that seemed almost symbolic, as if the world itself was aware that something new was beginning. And the rancher, who had lived so long by routine, found himself strangely unsettled yet hopeful as he watched the children tumble out of the small guest room he had offered them, rubbing their eyes, whispering with awe at the vastness of the land that stretched out before them, while their mother stood on the porch with her shawl pulled tight, her eyes scanning the horizon like a woman who had learned never to take safety for granted. And in that fragile stillness, the rancher realized he was no longer waiting for a bride who might never arrive, but standing at the start of a life he had not imagined, a life where every choice would shape not only his destiny but the future of 6 souls, who now looked at him with a mixture of trust and hesitation. And as days turned into weeks, he discovered the rhythm of ranch life was no longer his alone, for the boys insisted on following him into the pastures, eager to learn the ropes, their laughter filling spaces that had once echoed with silence, While the little girls picked wild flowers and left them on the kitchen table, small tokens of gratitude that softened even the hardest days. And the widow, though burdened by grief, began to move with a quiet determination, mending clothes, cooking meals, and standing shoulder to shoulder with him as though she belonged there all along. Yet beneath every moment of growing closeness lay the unspoken truth that she had never promised to stay, and he had never asked, because both carried wounds of disappointment. He from the bride who never came, and she from the husband, whose absence still lingered in her. Children's tears at night. But little by little, the prairie itself seemed to weave them together, testing them with storms, droughts, and the endless demands of cattle, until one evening when lightning split the sky and fire threatened to sweep across the range. They fought side by side to save what they could, her sons hauling water, his strong hands guiding them, her youngest crying in fear until he scooped her into his arms with a gentleness that surprised even himself. And when the fire was finally beaten back and the night grew quiet again, they stood together covered in ash, their breaths heavy, their hearts pounding with the raw truth that they were no longer strangers bound by circumstance but a family forged in trial. Yet even as feelings deepened, challenges loomed, for whispers in town began to stir about the widow living on a bachelor's ranch. Tongues sharp and judgmental, and offers came from men with less honor, men who saw her desperation as weakness. But the rancher, steady and unyielding, stood as her shield, declaring with his actions, though not yet his words, that she and her children had found a home. And one night under a canopy of stars, when the children finally slept and the prairie lay hushed, he turned to her and said with a trembling sincerity that this was not the life he expected, but it was the only one he wanted. And if she could find it in her heart to trust him, he would gladly be father to her children and partner to her soul. And tears filled her eyes because though her journey west had been born from sorrow, it had led her to something she never thought she'd find again. Love, not arranged by a letter, but written by God's own hand upon the wide open sky. And friends, if you followed this story all the way here, you know how powerful it has been. And the best way to keep walking with us through these unforgettable journeys of grit, faith, and second chances is to subscribe right now, because stories like this are just the beginning, and the next one may touch your heart even deeper.